It's safe to say that roguelikes dominate the indie market. Over the past 10 years, the floodgates have been wide open, and countless roguelikes have hit the Steam front page, each bringing their own unique twist to the genre. Hades brought us gripping top-down action combat, Slay the Spire brought us strategic deck-building goodness, and Darkest Dungeon gave us all a damn migraine. But regardless of their subgenres, all roguelikes share one thing in common: item progression. Items, relics, artifacts, trinkets, the name changes but the purpose is the same. These item upgrades greatly impact your enjoyment of the game. That's why developers spend just as much time and energy designing items as they do characters, enemies, and abilities. So today we're popping the hood on this mess I call a game to find out how I strung together an item effect management system. If you look at other roguelikes, you'll notice that most items can be defined by two traits: an effect and a trigger condition. Most triggers are pretty simple, such as when a player attacks or when an enemy dies, but others are very specific to the game's system mechanics, like interrupting an enemy's cast. For Project Bloom, I started by creating a list of all potential trigger conditions I could think of, like on shielding, on being hit, on start of battle, and so on. But eventually I ran out of ideas, so I did what any good developer does in this situation, and I drew inspiration. I studied the items in other games like Inkbound and Slay the Spire. I like how Inkbound describes their effects because they explicitly state trigger conditions in their text. So after expanding my list of trigger conditions, I did a similar exercise for the effects. I listed all of the effects I already had in the game, like stat increases and dot effects, and added some new ones that interacted directly with the new combat system, like effects that modified your position in the timeline, or effects that improved your cast speed. Mix some triggers with effects and you've got yourself a whole list of items. So with all the notes written down, it was time for the part that I love the most: bringing it all into the engine. To start, every item in the game is created using Unity's scriptable object. As a reminder, and in super simplified terms, scriptable objects are just containers for game data. I can pull all of an item's information like its name, sprite, cost, and most importantly, its effects, all in one convenient place. Just so you know, in Project Bloom, items are not actually equipped to individual units, but rather they are shared by the party. It's team equipment. Each item has a role assigned to it, namely a tank, support, or DPS. And the units also have a similar role assignment. If the unit's role matches the item's role, then boom, you've got a match. However, there are some items that can work with multiple roles. When the battle starts, the unit will store a reference to that item internally and will have access to the item's effect later. So we know where to find the item effects, which are stored inside of the unit, but how do we actually trigger those effects? Each trigger condition is kind of different and lives in different part of the code. For example, when an enemy gets hit versus when the player gains a shield. They live in different parts of the overall code. And that's before we consider the 20 other trigger conditions. So where do we place the checks? Well, everywhere. I check for item trigger conditions in the parts of the code that handles said effect. Like on enemy death, item effects get checked when an enemy dies. But if you're not careful, that can actually get pretty messy and it's very unoptimal. The simplest way to check effects from a programming point of view would have been to check every unit's equipment and see if the trigger conditions were met. But doing that 20 times each turn is just a waste of CPU. Instead, I created an item effect manager. The item effect manager's job is relatively simple. It separates each item effect by its trigger conditions and units who can activate the effect, and places them in separate lists. We can then place functions that call on the item's effect only for the specified trigger conditions. For example, do on cast complete gets checked after a cast is complete, and will only check a list of on cast complete effects. And if there are no effects currently assigned to that trigger condition, then the game simply ignores it and continues. The best part of this system is that I can place any number of effects with any number of trigger conditions for an impressive number of item combinations, really only limited by my own creativity. Now, there's a really interesting side effect to the whole team equipment system, and that is what happens when multiple units can benefit from the same effect. For example, let's say I have an item where on the start of battle, if there is a support on your party, apply a burn to a random enemy. Well, what if you're running 3 support characters? Well, now the effect is just triggered 3 times, because each unit triggered the effect. I spent some time figuring out how I could fix this, like maybe putting a cooldown on the item and all these types of things, but eventually I settled for what any good developer does. I called it a feature. Instead of preventing players from breaking the game, I'm just gonna let them break it and then try to figure out how to make it fun later. I'm still not sold on the whole team equipment idea, but I'll let the playtesting determine if it should stay or not. I'm actually pretty close to having a prototype built soon, and should be able to share with others after some internal rounds of playtesting. Now, this system isn't perfect. I'm sure some real coding gurus out there would have been able to do something much better and much more elegant, and if you're one of them, I would love to know how you would have done this, for real. With that said, if you enjoyed today's video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. I really do appreciate it. I upload a video every other Thursday because that's just what my schedule currently allows for. Additionally, you can wishlist Project Bloom on Steam. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.